Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with interesting people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a certified peer counselor, Jeff Fullington. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me, Jeff.
Thank you. Hi.
It's great to have you here, Jeff. So if you could just share to us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
How I ended up where?
How you ended up doing what you're doing.
Oh, I'm a certified peer counselor. It means I'm somebody with lived experience with mental health issues. I have PTSD. I watched my partner die in the ICU in 2007, and I've never been the same since. It really kind of messed me up inside, and that's when most of my mental health conditions started. And from there, I ended up in Seattle, Washington, and they have a peer program here where you can go through a training and get certified to use your PTSD and your mental health conditions to help other people with the same conditions. So I kind of fell into that. I don't really remember how. I think I was volunteering. And from there, I became a certified peer, and I started doing that as a career. And I can't imagine doing anything else now. I love mental health. I love working with people with mental health issues. I'm also autistic, on the autism spectrum, so I work a lot with autistic people too, kids and adults. So kind of the intersection of mental health and autism is where I seem to do my best work.
Thank you for sharing to us how you started working as a peer counselor. But if you could just step back a bit, a lot of people do not know what a peer counselor is. So what exactly is peer counselor, and how does that role fit into the mental health landscape or the therapeutic process?
Okay. It's kind of a new role, I guess, over the last few decades, and it's different by each state. At least here in the United States, each state has their own certification program and requirements, and some states don't have any requirements at all. But basically, I have PTSD, so if somebody else has PTSD, I live it from the inside. I know what it feels like. I know what it's like to be triggered and escalate. I know what the chemicals in my brain are doing at any given moment and when I'm having a PTSD episode. So if somebody else has PTSD, I can draw on my own experience with the condition to help them, to support them, to troubleshoot issues, to talk about strategies and tips that help us work and cope and recover. Same with the autism. So I have depression, dissociation, all trauma related, but the trauma is really the core of my mental health work. So somebody with depression, let's say, or anxiety, they know what it's like. They live it every day. They wake up with it. They can help somebody with the same condition in a way that a clinician or some other professional that doesn't experience that specific condition is able to help, because they're seeing it a little more remotely from the outside. And somebody like me that's a peer is living it from the inside. So it creates that bridge right away, that rapport where you can help. It's basically just support. Here's what works for me. Here's what I've experienced. Here's what's helped me. What's going on with you? And another important thing to know about peer support is it's two things, I think. It's mutual. So it's not me in one position helping somebody in a different position. We're both in the same boat. We're both experiencing the same thing. And the support is mutual. I get as much support from the people I help as they get from me. So it's more of there's less of a power differential. It's more of an equal kind of helping relationship. And the second important thing, I think, is that we don't do a diagnosis. That's more of a clinical concept. We just meet the person where they are, however they are. We don't really get into the label of what condition they have or this or that. I mean, stuff like PTSD and bipolar and depression that are clinical diagnoses, a lot of times peers, they'll match other peers up with the same diagnoses because the experience is so similar. But that's about as far as the peer support movement goes with diagnoses, because we're not clinicians.
It's a good thing that you mentioned about that there's no power differential. Is that the word? It basically works like, partnership. Two people who've got similar live experience and they work together. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So,
Exactly.
but do you have an approach to peer counseling, or is it just more of, kind of like trying to walk together, or are there different approaches to peer counseling?
It's so individualized. Each peer is different. We all have our own strengths that we bring, and each client is different. So I never know from one client to the next exactly what I'm going to be doing. It's kind of whatever is needed by that client. But if I do have any kind of general approach, I would say it's self-empowerment. I help people find ways to empower themselves to deal with their issues, to move the locus of control from the external world to inside of themselves. Like, what can I do in this situation to help improve it? What can I do to take control of this issue happening in my life? And with PTSD especially, it's so story driven. It's about the past and memories and what happened. And so one thing I do pretty regularly is I work with people's stories, like it can be from birth on, and we go through their timeline and we can look at ways that they've self-empowered in the past. They have coping skills that they've naturally drawn on that they may not be aware of. And so I kind of try to work with their story and help bring the areas to light where they've already successfully mastered an issue or they've already successfully coped. And I try to kind of build a set of tools or coping skills to show that they do have their own power. They've had power in the past over issues, or they wouldn't be here talking to me right now. So they've gotten through somehow, and we try to spotlight the ways that they've coped in the past, or I call it self-empowerment, and so that they can be more aware of that and reinforce that and fortify that and use that in future situations.
Hmm. Now, I understand because I did a bit of research and I understand you're also a team member for Peer Hopes. So if you could just tell us about a bit about the organization.
Well, Peer Hopes is a online peer support. Most peer support originally it was Medicaid. It was a Medicaid service that the federal government rolled out, and it was Medicaid billable. So it was a lot of the mental health agencies that got federal or state money were able to charge Medicaid for peer support services. I've seen it kind of move out of the agencies gradually. It's still a part of the agencies, but peers have developed their own forms of delivering service outside of the Medicaid model. And community peers, online peer support, especially during COVID, a lot of peer support moved online. So this peer named Leslie from Texas started an online service, and there's a team of us that we work one-on-one. We used to do by Zoom. We switched to another service recently, but basically we do one-on-one in groups, and there's all different types of peers. I work mostly with autism, neurodiversity, giftedness, twice exceptional, and it's basically just an online peer service, and it's not tied to any specific state. So we're able to help people from across the globe, really, anybody with an internet connection. We also do phone support, so I guess it's not even limited to internet. And it's the same kind of peer service you would get if you went to your local mental health agency. It's just online by video or phone.
And of course, you don't just Peer Hopes. They don't just offer services for those with autism and PTSD. I understand you try to offer services to people with a range of issues. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I help where I can. PTSD is my main, or trauma rather, is my main. That's kind of what led me into the mental health world, and that's the core of where my mental health issues stem from. But if anything I've experienced in life overlaps, like I can work with depression, I can work with dissociation, I can work with childhood trauma. I've had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, so I can work with that kind of that developmental trauma. So if it's in my range of experience, I can usually try to help with it. If not, I can refer to other peers or help them find somebody that might better fit what they're going through. Because since it's experience based, you really want a peer that's knows what it's like to have the same experience that you're having. So if you're going through depression and the peer you're working with has never experienced depression, they may not be the best peer to help you with the depression. And then, like I said, I also, with the autism, I work with the neurodiversity side too. ADHD, autism, giftedness, anybody weird or different, really, because there's issues that come from being on the spectrum that kind of intersect or work with or kind of combine with the PTSD. So you have meltdowns, you have tantrums, you have PTSD triggers, the fight or flight response. And it can all look like one big confusing thing to somebody that maybe doesn't have experience with the subtle differences between a meltdown and a fight or flight response. So I also can help I used to teach special ed. I've worked in an adolescent psych unit. So I can also help with the neurodiversity issues too, which are a little different from mental health, because in the peer world, we have this concept of recovery. You can recover from, I don't think you ever fully recover from mental health conditions, but you can make progress. You can improve your experience of them. You can recover from drugs and alcohol. So there's this concept of recovery is possible. Well, with autism and neurodiversity, it's not something you recover from. So it kind of takes a different orientation or approach. It's something you can manage. You can minimize the negative impacts it has in your life. You can improve your experience, just general life experience with it, but you don't really recover from it. So the recovery model doesn't work as well for things like autism and neurodiversity. So when you have it all combined in one person, you have mental health issues and autism and neurodiversity, you're really working with either a complex model or 2 or 3 models all at once. And I'm able to work with that set of clients as well.
You said that the concept of recovery doesn't generally fit with autism. Would you say the same with PTSD? Is it also more of management or?
PTSD, you can make improvements. Like my PTSD started 2007? Is that 13 years ago? I hope it's not 23 years. Let's say it's 13 years ago. Over that time, there's been a definite improvement. I remember myself in the early months. I remember myself the first few years. I could see, and then I've had trauma since that kind of set me back. But there's an arc of progress where the symptoms become less or the reactions become less, or you know how to manage them better when they do happen. So in that sense, I wouldn't, like, your brain's never going to go back to normal. My brain's never going to be like it was before the PTSD. So in that sense, I don't fully expect to recover 100% and bounce back as my old self. But you can make improvements in progress where the symptoms kind of diminish or change or are lessened. With things like autism and ADHD and neurodiversity, the condition is not ever going to go away or change significantly. Mm-hmm. Somebody with ADHD is always going to struggle with the same form or manifestations of ADHD that they've always struggled with. You can improve I guess you can improve the way it impacts your life, but the actual structure of your brain is not going to improve. Or I guess if something's organic, you're not going to recover from it. Your brain's not going to suddenly start being a different structure or type of brain. So in that sense, no, I don't think you recover from the brain stuff, the neurodiversity, the PTSD, but you can recover from the effects it has in your life, and you can recover from the impact it has on other people. And recovery was originally a concept that came from the addiction and substance use world. So even applying it to mental health, that was a secondary application of the concept.
Now,
I
Jeff,
myself don't use
sorry, go
recovery
ahead.
much as a concept. It comes from the peer. It's in the peer world. It's in our training. I myself don't find myself using the concept of recovery much. I use the concept of progress, really. Like, are you improving? Are you moving toward your goals? Or are you moving away from your goals? Are you moving toward a healthier life and sense of being, or are you moving away from that? So for me, it's just a concept of progress, and it's directional. It's towards or away from whatever your goal is.
And it really makes sense, because the idea of peer counseling is really new to me. It really makes sense if you're working with another person who has a similar live experience, like what you've said. Someone who has experience of PTSD would know what actually triggers those symptoms, and just like you've mentioned about autism, it really fits in with, shall we say, that the counseling process. I just want to talk more about counseling, Jeff. Over the past decades, the mental health landscape, the counseling landscape has made significant progress. But a lot of people still do not avail of therapeutic services. What kind of changes would you like to see within, the counseling and the mental health landscapes? What do you think people within your profession should do to make it more accessible to the wider public?
I think just destigma. I've seen mental health. I remembered in the 70s when I grew up, and it was very stigmatized. Like, you didn't talk about it. If you went to therapy at all, it was this huge progress to even go to therapy. It was months, perhaps years of self-exploration and getting yourself to the point where you had the courage to even call a therapist. And now it seems much more talked about openly, much more destigmatized. People are comfortable talking about depression, or they're comfortable telling a friend about their anxiety or even PTSD, anything, trauma. It's in the media more as less of a stigmatized experience for people. So I've seen great progress just in my lifetime as far as having it be something that's not really talked about, to having it be a normal part of the human experience that you can talk about with your friends, your colleagues. People talk about it at work. It's in our TV shows as kind of this thing that just happens. Sometimes it's not even, it's just something in the background. You may have a character that just happens to have depression or PTSD, but it's not really a integral part of the plot line. It's just this background fact about themselves. So I've seen it become, I guess, take less center stage and be this very heavy, fraught issue that nobody wanted to touch or knew how to deal with, to being something that, okay, yeah, it's kind of normalized, I guess. So the more you, and that's another thing I do with my work a lot, is I try to normalize mental health conditions. I try to normalize autism. I try to normalize PTSD when someone's triggered and they get escalated. It can look scary and frightening to people that are not familiar with what's happening. But I try to normalize it. This person has PTSD. They're having a completely normal reaction for the condition that they have. This person's autistic. They're having a meltdown. I know it looks weird, but it's completely normal for somebody with their nervous system. So I think the more mental health can be normalized, I think it destigmatizes it. It makes the person having the experience more comfortable about it, and the people around them, their friends, their coworkers, their family, more comfortable about having a mental health condition. Is hard enough in and of itself. When you throw up extra barriers like social stigma, or demonizing it, or ostracizing people, or making it, I don't know, treating people differently just because they have a certain mental health condition or they're on the spectrum, that adds additional social barriers on top of the internal barriers and struggles that they're already experiencing from having the condition itself. So I think anything you can do to lessen those social barriers and create a supportive environment to where they could kind of focus on the mental health effects themselves or the condition itself without having to also struggle with the additional social barriers, social anxiety. I would say that's probably the best thing. That it's easy to do, and it's the best thing anybody can do, and anybody can kind of step back and I don't know, maybe be less reactive about mental health conditions and learn. I've seen it happen with. I grew up gay. I've seen it happen with homosexuality. Was kind of scary and stigmatized early in my life, and now it's hardly a big deal at all. Like, people are completely comfortable with it for the most part. Autism, I think, is heading in that direction. You have transgender and the different gender identities becoming more normalized. So the same thing, and I think it is happening with mental health. I just think to the extent that it can happen more and more, that would improve the mental health field, I think, probably more than anything else. Having people experiencing mental health being comfortable to go seek out help, which I think is happening. Having mental health more normalized, to maybe somebody hasn't experienced a mental health problem before and they suddenly start to experience symptoms and they're not sure what's happening. Having those symptoms be more comfortable, like media representation, and having the person feel more comfortable about, oh, okay, I'm experiencing something weird, but it's probably depression or it could be anxiety. Let me just call this hotline and find out. Or instead of just agonizing for months and months about what's wrong with me, I'm suddenly not feeling normal anymore. I don't want to tell anybody. I want to talk to my friends. I don't want to tell my spouse. I think having it be more normalized would reduce that and make people just feel much more comfortable. What they're doing here in Washington State is they've done integration where now if you go to your medical doctor, your primary care doctor, they start to talk about mental health issues, and you can get referrals for mental health conditions from your medical doctor now. So they're trying to integrate mental health with physical health care and just have it be all one. It's just all health care. And so something like that too might be a good solution to improving the field, is just integrating it, at least having it all be healthcare and not separating it off into mental health care.
I appreciate the way you discuss the parallels between autism, mental health, and homosexuality. But I just want to play the devil's advocate here, Jeff. You mentioned that throughout your lifetime, you've seen how mental health discussions about autism has normalized. But would you also say that we're also verging towards the point of kind of glamorizing it? Just as an example, there's common statistics that they say that 1 in 4 people are affected by mental health. But actually, if you look at research, it's actually because a lot of people are actually self-diagnosing themselves. Like, for instance, research says that a lot of people have anxiety and depression, but it's not actually like clinical anxiety, but they're using it like, the mainstream use of anxiety. Would you say that that's because of kind of, making mental health issues, kind of, glamour, especially that part of it, you discuss how we have transformed the conversations about mental health. We kind of normalize it, but also because of the presence of the internet, a lot of people can just, self-identify that I've got X mental health issues, I've got X symptoms. Would you say that we're also heading towards glamorizing it?
I have two thoughts about that. One is if it is being glamorized, or somebody is taking on a mental health issue just because it's trendy, they're not experiencing actual, like, people that actually have PTSD or depression to where they can't get out of bed, or autistic where their social interactions are just one nightmare after another. There's nothing glamorous about any of that. And if I think it takes, I don't know, because I'm also thinking about like the transgender, the rates of transgenderism among young people, and some of it seems to be social contagion or just kind of going along with a trend to fit in or be cool. If that's the reason somebody's reporting a mental health issue or suddenly on the spectrum because it's cool or they're trying to fit in, I don't think those people, I don't think you can do that long term. Like those people are not mental health. You suffer like there's mental, physical suffering from it, and it's nothing to glamorize or take on just to be cool or fit in a social trend. Now, one thing I do see happening is the concept of trauma is being brought into where almost anything is trauma nowadays. If somebody looks at you in a uncomfortable way, that's trauma. If somebody calls you the wrong pronoun or misgender, that's trauma. Trauma, as I know it, as I've experienced it, it changes your brain. It alters you in almost this organic way that's so fundamental that you're not the same afterwards. Being called the wrong pronoun is, to me, is not going to damage your brain. It's not going to fall under the definition of trauma that alters how your brain functions. So I deal with what I call real trauma. Like if somebody comes to me and the worst thing happening in their life is that somebody, I don't know, microaggression that made them feel uncomfortable, I don't know how much I would be able to help that person, because that's not trauma like I know trauma, and I wouldn't know what to do with that kind of trauma. I guess I would self-empower them. I would help them look at ways they can manage their reaction to it and maybe become more resilient in the future if somebody calls them a name or looks at them a way that they don't like in the future. I wouldn't address it as trauma. I wouldn't address it using the techniques I would use for somebody that came in with PTSD. I would use, again, it's that locus of control. I would find ways to have them less at the mercy of other people and more kind of empowered within themselves to master the situation or take control of the situation from within. So what a lot of people are calling trauma, to me, is not trauma the way I know trauma, where you actually feel a change within your brain on a physical level. So in that sense, I think that the concept of trauma might, I don't know if I'd call it glamorized, but it's kind of spreading beyond it being any kind of useful concept anymore. So maybe in that sense, I think there is some, what do I want to say here? I think some things in the mental health world and the neurodivergent world need to be kind of narrowed to something more useful and practical that can actually be worked with and help people, and maybe have another name for this. I don't know. This shows up a lot in my work. This kind of, I don't know what you call it. I have a hard time calling it trauma because it doesn't, it's not what I'm used to working with as trauma. So in that sense, I think, yes, there is some I don't know, maybe as the concept of mental health makes its way out into the larger society, people are maybe evaluating and assessing themselves for, is this something I fall into? Do I also have mental health conditions? And maybe things that don't rise to the level of something that necessarily impacts their life may start to look like mental health conditions to them. They it's hard to say, because somebody that has never experienced really debilitating depression or really debilitating anxiety, and don't have anything to reference it to, they may think that that is depression or anxiety. If they feel uncomfortable in a social situation because somebody said a little comment to them that was rude, that may be the peak anxiety that they've experienced in their life. And so to them, that may be anxiety, or that may be depression or trauma. But once you move out into the mental health world and start talking to a range of people that experience these conditions, I guess you get I don't like to diminish any individual person's experience, but there is kind of a relational element to some of this, where in relation to this person's trauma, being misgendered is not on the same level of trauma, I guess. I feel like I'm getting into controversial territory here, but I just look at it from a practical level of the people, my own trauma, and the trauma of the people I worked with. There's just some trauma that responds to techniques that help with PTSD and that type of trauma. And there's other things that are called trauma and anxiety that I think respond to different techniques that are more geared towards self-empowerment and shifting that locus of control. And so in my work, at least, there's two different levels of trauma, or it seems to be they can be categorized two different ways. And I would use one set of tools on this thing called trauma, and I would use a different set of tools on this other thing called trauma, which is more social trauma, like what you were talking about, the glamorization and the bandwagon of all of a sudden everybody's showing up with mental health issues. And some of them are, I'm just going to say, they're just not as severe as some of the other issues that I work with clients.
Now, you say it's not really as severe. We used the word glamorization earlier, but would you also say that the psychotherapy and the mental health landscape has been politicized in the past few years? And when I mean politicized, say for instance, you mentioned earlier about words such as microaggression. Right now, there's also a trend to like kind of of course, we can't really detach someone's identity and someone's heritage with their lived experience, but there's a trend now that to focus on these characteristics, and this kind of affects the therapeutic process, and I would call that kind of politicizing psychotherapy. Would you also agree with that observation?
Yes, I think there is a trend. I'm shaking my head, yes, and it depends on what you mean by politicization. But I think that there is a trend where I call it wokeness, the critical social justice ideology, it sees people as their characteristics or their demographics, and that is the most significant and important thing about a person. And I think that is causing the therapeutic focus to shift from the individual as an individual and the everything internal that might be going on with the person or contributing to why they're in the office in the first place, to the fact that they're white, or they're black, or they're whatever color, or they're this gender, or they're this social characteristic, becoming the dominant cause, explanation, factor in why they're seeking mental health services. And in that sense, I do think it's a political ideology. I think there's potentially a political agenda behind it. And I think that has no place in the therapeutic setting at all. Like I think the therapeutic setting is there to focus on the individual. And in the peer world, it's very person-centered. We have a concept of meeting the person where they are. I think that interferes with the ability to meet someone where they are, because usually when they come into my office, at least, where they are is not a white person or a black person or this particular gender. Where they are is more internally focused. It's what they're experiencing internally as a human, as an individual. And it's the same across races, across genders. Like, it's so individualized. To make their skin color or their gender or their social background the dominant factor of why they're seeking therapy and what therapy should focus on, to me, obscures or eclipses or displaces the actual internal reasons that they're there, that are so these social demographic characteristics, which are political characteristics, are so secondary or peripheral to the stuff that I actually work on as a peer with a person. And I see the focus shifting to those characteristics, these social demographic characteristics, more and more, and less of the person as an individual or meeting the person where they are. And in that sense, I do think that there's this kind of trend of politicizing mental health. There's a lot of diversity, equity trainings that we go to as peers here in Washington State. Since COVID, the last year or so, every training I've went to, every peer event, every activity that was put on by the state or the county as a peer kind of continuing education or a peer training has been about race, has been about equity, has been about what's going on in society. They had the protest here last summer. None of it has been on a mental health topic. I have not been to a training in years on depression, on trauma, on PTSD, on anything mental health related. It's all been racial justice, social equity, gender this, gender that. And those are probably valid concerns for some, but I every time at these trainings, I'm wondering what this has to do with mental health, what this has to do with peer support. Why do I need to be in this training? How is it going to help me help my clients? And I'm still looking for those answers. So in that sense, I've seen the focus shift to these more politically oriented goals and agendas and less focused on individual, like how can we help this individual as a person with whatever they're going through in this moment. And it's usually almost always completely unrelated to whatever their social demographic is experiencing politically at the time. But I have seen that focus shift more and more on the social and political and less on the individual as an individual. In fact, there's a network I'm part of called Critical Therapy Antidote, and it's a network of mental health professionals and clients that it's global. It started out of the UK, and they came together for specifically this reason, because they see it encroach more and more in their therapeutic work. The regulatory bodies, the clients themselves are frustrated. They just want help with their marriage issue, or they just want help with their depression, and they're being told to examine their racial backgrounds and their gender identities. And the clients themselves, a lot of them don't even want this, or are questioning how this applies to the issue they're at the office for.
Well, you said, Jeff, about we don't really, well, you're not really trying to invalidate other people's experience. Like what you said, these are really valid concerns. But as a counselor, as a peer counselor yourself, you don't want to kind of, replace the issue with your demographics, with what you're actually experiencing. And like what you've said, not all should be viewed in the prism of, your demographics. And I think that's where you're coming from as a counselor, that, you're just trying to protect the integrity of the therapeutic process. Yeah. Another thing that I want to ask you, Jeff, is that you've been a peer counselor for such a long time. So I'm quite certain that you've come across a number of misconceptions about peer counseling. So if you could kind of, identify those identify those misconceptions and address them.
Probably the biggest one is that the misconception is that we're therapists or clinicians. The reality, the important thing to know is we're not clinicians. It's not a clinical model at all, and we're not therapists. It's not peer support is not therapy. So we don't do any. It can be therapeutic, but we don't. There's not a therapeutic process through peer support that we guide the client through. It's more support. It's I don't know. It's this equal mutual support. It's a lot of the trainings, the direction that the mental health field itself is trying to nudge peer support is really a clinical direction that is not applicable to what peer support is supposed to be or based on, which is our lived experience. So that's probably the biggest misconception, even within the clinical, even the mental health field itself, among clinicians, and even peer supporters sometimes, I think, start to fall into this clinical mindset. So that's the biggest one I would want to challenge the most, is that we aren't clinical, and peer support requires a totally different approach professionally than the approach that you would take with clinicians or therapists, and that it's not therapy. So manage the expectations. If you turn to peer support, it can be very helpful. I have clients that find me more helpful than their actual therapist, but I'm not there in the role of a therapist. I'm there in the role of an equal and kind of a partner in the, with my clients. They're in charge of their own. I'm there to help them reach whatever goals they set for themselves and to facilitate that process. But I'm not there to kind of troubleshoot and diagnose and tell them the direction they should go in to get improvement. It's very much they're in the driver's seat. I just help them explore. I help them troubleshoot, strategize based on what's helped me in my own journey. But I'm not there to, I don't know. I'm not there to help develop them in any particular therapeutic direction. So I guess that's the answer. Is we're not clinical and we're not therapists.
Mm-hmm. Now, some question.
But that doesn't make us less valuable. Like the value that comes from peer support can be equal or even greater in some cases than the value that you get from clinical services or therapeutic services. I think they all have their own role, and they're all the right tool in certain situations and the less helpful tool in other situations. So it's just a different tool in the toolbox. But it's not less valuable or more valuable. It's just another way to approach mental health.
Absolutely. Now, I just want to ask the same question in relation to autism, because you've mentioned you have autism. So what's your, what are the misconceptions that you've come across with autism? And again, it's your opportunity to kind of address them.
The biggest misconception, I think, is that it's one thing that you either have or don't have. It's so complex and individualized. They're looking at, I think, maybe close to 1,000 genes by now that all interact in these complex ways to create the experience of what people call autism. I prefer neurodiversity. Actually, autism seems a subset of something much larger. I don't think the scientific world and the clinical world has caught up to what autism actually is. I don't even know if they're close. I wish that when people hear autism, it's more of a label, and I think it starts to narrow their conception into something that's, I guess another way to say what I'm trying to say is it's very hard to take your experience of one autistic person and apply it in any useful way to any other autistic person. And so it's almost not even a useful concept, because knowing that somebody is autistic or on the autism spectrum tells you almost nothing about how that autism is going to manifest or be experienced. So many of us, just as humans, probably have some portion of these genes that are interacting in some kind of way. So I don't even know if the concept of spectrum is even helpful. I don't know much about the genetic research and the epigenetics of it, but when you look at it on the genetic level, it's just so complex. And to make out like it's this one thing that you either have or don't have, I think that would be the biggest misconception about it that I would want to get out there, is that I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's different from individual to individual. I think it is a contrast with what we call neurotypical, and that's as far as I think the concept is useful. But what that contrast is and how it presents in each individual is so different from person to person that hearing that somebody's autistic and drawing any kind of conclusion from that, I think you're guessing. I don't know how helpful it is as a concept. I wish they could either narrow it down into more specific subsets, but even that, you run into the same issue from individual to individual. You're still going to encounter so much difference that even these subcategories may not be helpful, or just create this really broad category, which they try to do with neurodiversity, where you're prepared for anything. Like you take the person as the person, and you know they're neurodiverse, but that's all you know until you meet them, and then you kind of get to know their own individual form of neurodiversity. I find that much more helpful than trying to categorize it or label it as a phenomenon. Just have it be this really broad, open thing called neurodiversity, and then just deal with it on an individual level from there.
Thank you. I suppose the key takeaway here about misconceptions, whether peer counseling or the autism community, is that you can't really put a lot of things in a box, and you just have to kind of have an open-minded approach, whether it's peer counseling or whether it's autism. Now, I just want to dig deeper to you, not as a peer counselor, but I suppose more of as an individual. So I prepared a few questions to get to know you more, Jeff. So is there a particular piece of writing or an individual was the greatest influence to your work?
My great passion is literature. I wanted to be an English teacher, and so all of the classics I find something useful. But if I had to pick one, I tell people all the time, if you don't have access to peer support, if there's not a person you can call, if there's not a friend you can turn to, go out and find you a copy of the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. That is the closest thing to having a live person there giving support. He's so central to, I'm also a Satanist. He's central to my conception of Satanism. He's central to my conception of the individual. It's all about self-empowerment. It's all about the value you have as an individual. And probably more than any other writer, I think he speaks to those values and the work I try to do around those values. So probably if I had to pick one writer, it would be Ralph Waldo Emerson.
You kind of pick up my interest when you said that you're a Satanist. I'm not really familiar with that kind of, shall we say, orientation, for lack of a better word. But in a nutshell, what's the theoretical underpinning of Satanism?
Just like with autism, there's so many different types and forms of Satanism. I'm non-theistic, which means I don't actually believe in a devil, a supernatural entity called Satan. It's a metaphor. It's not a metaphysic. It's a aesthetic and an ethos. And for me, it centers on The strong value I hold around anti-authoritarianism. They had the Church of Satan in the 60s, which was more social Darwinistic oriented. And recently they developed the Satanic Temple, which is what I actually became a member of, although I've since disaffiliated and now I'm just an independent Satanist. And the Satanic Temple is more social justice oriented, and neither form of Satanism really fits me. What speaks to me about it is more I've always been a bad boy. I'm a rebel. And is the anti-authoritarianism, like autonomy, individuality, self-determination. It's the religion of all of those things. It's the religion of creativity. It's the religion of the outcast, the misfit, the rebel. So like every core value that I hold, Satanism as a religion speaks to. And I was an atheist for most of my life. So the transition to Satanism is very recent, but it gives me a sense of spirituality that was missing as an atheist for most of my adult life. And so I'm kind of exploring it. I'm figuring out what it means to me to be a Satanist. And I study Romanticism, John Milton, Paradise Lost, William Blake, the Romantics, Shelley, Wordsworth. And so a lot of that, like the figure of Satan, shows up a lot in the Romantics. And it kind of ties together. I'm a punk. Rock and roll has been central to my life. Romantic literature, anti-authoritarianism. So it kind of ties all of that together into one package and one umbrella and one aesthetic. And so it's kind of permeated my life from the beginning. I just didn't know the name for it, to call it Satanism. But the figure of Satan and what he represents for me and for a lot of Satanists is, I think, at the center of it, those values of autonomy and self-determination.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, what's the message? I mean, you've been active with counseling, with mental health landscape. So what's the most important thing you want the public to know about your work?
I think individuality, creativity, individuality, like the value that you have as an individual, just as a part of the human species. I think you bring a value with you from birth by just being born, just being human, just being an individual. There's something unique about you. There's strengths that you bring into the world as an individual. Everything I do, I think, is focused on exploring what that value is, what those strengths are, intensifying them, helping them to manifest, fortifying them, strengthening them. I think that is the thread that runs through everything I'm passionate about, everything I do professionally, everything I do recreationally. I think it's all centered about what is the value of the individual as an individual.
That's a brilliant message, Jeff. How do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Well, before COVID, I like to hike and camp a lot. I love the outdoors. I could spend just weeks and weeks outside playing around. But indoors, I read a lot. I love to listen to music, rock and roll, rock music. And I love board games a lot. Cosmic Encounter is my favorite. But lately, during COVID, I've been Zooming. I Zoom pretty much from the time I wake up to, I've spent the entire year, I pretty much have not left my apartment since last March, and I've had a more robust social life than I've ever had the last 10 years of actually leaving my house in Seattle. I've met more people from all over the world. I started a Zoom community. Our goal is to eventually go 24 hours, but right now we run pretty much from 6 a.m. to about midnight. And it's a drop-in community. There's people from all over the world that show up. And that is what relaxes me probably the most lately, is just getting to socialize with interesting people and all the friends I've met through Zoom. And I'm an extrovert, so anytime I get a chance I love meeting people. I love talking to new people. anytime I get a chance to do that, it relaxes me and helps me kind of get out of myself. And so Zoom has been giving me an opportunity to do that. I've also started doing more podcasts. I do a podcast with a guy named Nemo out of Minneapolis. We're going to start doing more podcasts. That's another thing that helps me unwind and relax.
And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a peer counselor?
I have no idea. I set out to be an English teacher, and it veered drastically from there. I don't know. Teaching, some kind of counseling or support role, or teaching, or I think all the jobs I've ever had have always been kind of that education or support role. So I think I would be doing some form of that. It just would not be taking the form of peer counseling. Actually, that's not true. I've been a peer my whole life. Even if there was not something called peer support or peer counseling, I would still be doing it. It would describe what I do. And so it would be some kind of support role or educational role. It just happens to be called peer counseling right now by society. But I can't imagine doing anything other than the work I've been doing. I've worked with youth. I really like working with I was the problem child growing up. I'm really good with other problem children. I like working with the kids that nobody else knows what to do with, the ones that are at risk, the ones kind of on the edge of society, and they can go either way. I like to help them go a way that's constructive.
And finally, Jeff, what else is in the pipeline? And if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at?
Well, my latest project, I've been doing it for a few months. It's called the Back Porch, or Back Porch Connections. And we have a Zoom called the Back Porch. It's the drop-in Zoom I just talked about. I love community building. I love bringing people together and help watching them grow and helping connections be made. So I have the Zoom platform that I'm helping to build. It's with several other peers here in Washington State. And we're starting to expand. We have a YouTube channel now. We're going to be doing more video work, more podcasts to kind of get our work out there to the larger world and give people a little window into what peer support is, into what we do as peers here on the Back Porch. But it's basically a community where people can come, and everything I do professionally has been geared toward creating spaces where people can come and discover their authentic self and start to actualize their authentic self, find their voice, who they are as a person. And so the Zoom community, the Back Porch, is kind of a space to do that. We're very non-judgmental. Show up as you are and discover who you are authentically as a person. And there's a community we've created to help kind of foster that. And we're going to we're going to keep doing the Zoom, but we're going to also do more video podcast type work as well. So I think over this next year, I'm going to be expanding this community, and I'm going to be extending it through podcast and video content too, through our YouTube channel. And I don't know if it's Back Porch. I don't know the web address actually. It's Back Porch Connections. Should I put it in the chat room?
Just give me the link, and then I'll put it on the description box.
Okay. I'll do that. And then I also have that podcast I started with my friend Nemo. It's called, I think we're going to call it New World Chaos. So I'll probably be doing more of that kind of work. And I'm also involved there's also several other Zooms I do with musicians, artists, songwriters, creative people. I use creativity a lot. It's one of my primary tools, and using creativity to help people kind of heal, work with their mental health issues, and actualize as a person. So there's a lot of, I do an open mic night with musicians. I'm going to be doing more creative workshops and workshops around creativity. So I think that's in the pipeline as well. But it'll all be through these podcasts and through the Back Porch.
Exactly.
So whatever I end up doing next year, it's going to be through these platforms.
Okay. So I'll just wait for you to send me the link, Jeff, and then once I have it, I'll put in a description box. So for anyone who's interested to join your community, they can get in touch with you directly. Well, Jeff, it's a pleasure having you here on the DRH show, but unfortunately our time is up. So I look forward to hearing more about your work. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion.